In 1947, in a cave above the Dead Sea, a Bedouin shepherd found the oldest biblical manuscripts ever discovered, texts that had been waiting in the desert dark for nearly 2,000 years, sealed in clay jars by people who believed the world was ending and wanted to preserve what they knew. The discovery was immediately recognized as one of the most significant finds in the history of archaeology, and the scholars who were given responsibility for the scrolls understood perfectly well what they held. What happened next is one of the stranger stories in the history of knowledge. The scholars did not publish. A year passed, then a decade, then 2 decades, then 3, and still the bulk of the scrolls sat unpublished, inaccessible to anyone outside a small circle of insiders who guarded their fragments with a tenacity that eventually began to look less like scholarly caution and more like something else entirely. The question that accumulated over those 40 years, and that this story is built around, is a simple one. What were they afraid the scrolls would say? Before we go further, if this kind of story is what brings you here at night, subscribing to the channel means the next one will be waiting for you when you are ready. There is no better company at this hour than history. Now, let us begin. It is the winter of 1947, and the Dead Sea is the color of pewter in the cold afternoon light, flat and heavy and utterly still. The lowest point on the surface of the earth, ringed by limestone cliffs, the color of pale bone. The air here smells of salt and mineral dust, and something else underneath it, something ancient and dry, the smell of desert rock that has held the same heat for thousands of years and releases it slowly in the evenings when the temperature drops. The caves in the cliffs above the water have been empty for 1900 years, or so everyone believes. There is almost no vegetation here. The land between the water and the cliffs is pale and cracked, a narrow strip of desert that in the winter months catches a thin, cold light, and in summer becomes something close to uninhabitable. Temperatures that would have made the ancient inhabitants of the plateau above drink carefully and move slowly and time their outdoor work for the hours before noon. The Dead Sea itself is not hospitable water. Nothing lives in it, and nothing grows along its shores in the way things grow along other shores, because the salt content is too high for ordinary life to persist. It is a beautiful place, if beauty can exist without softness, a place of extraordinary severity, color without comfort. The kind of landscape that makes a person feel very small and very far from anything that might be called ordinary. The plateau above the water is called Qumran, and it sits at the edge of the Judean wilderness, the rocky, eroded terrain that stretches westward from the Dead Sea toward Jerusalem. In the winter of 1947, it is a place that most people in the modern world have never heard of and would have no particular reason to visit. There are ruins on the plateau, low walls, and the outlines of rooms. But ruins in this part of the world are not unusual, and these particular ruins have attracted no special attention. The cliffs that rise above the plateau are pocked with natural caves, some of them large enough to shelter a person or an animal, and local Bedouin have known about these caves for generations, have used them occasionally for shelter or storage without finding anything in them worth reporting. That is about to change, though the change will arrive not through any deliberate excavation or organized scholarly expedition, but through the accidental trajectory of a thrown stone and the particular curiosity of a young man who heard something break in the dark. What connects the desert plateau of Qumran to the story that follows is a particular quality of the air. The Dead Sea sits more than 400 meters below sea level, and the atmosphere in the valley around it is dry in a way that is unusual even for desert climates, because the region receives almost no rainfall and the low elevation creates conditions that preserve organic material with unusual reliability. Leather dries and does not rot. Wood survives. Parchment, if it is sealed and kept from moisture, can last not for decades, but for centuries, and under the right conditions, for millennia. The people who hid things in these caves understood this, or they understood something functionally equivalent to it, which is that the desert keeps secrets better than almost any other environment on Earth. The story we are in needs to move in two directions at once: backward into the ancient world that produced the scrolls and forward into the modern world that received them. Both directions lead to the same question: what happens when knowledge is kept too long in the dark? 2,000 years ago, roughly speaking, the stretch of territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea was a province of the Roman Empire, administered uneasily and contested constantly, a place where the memory of Jewish self-governance under the Hasmonean dynasty had not yet faded, and where Roman authority was maintained through a combination of local client rulers, military praetor, and the kind of managed tolerance that the Romans applied to conquered peoples they found difficult to govern directly. The province was called Judea, and it was, in the middle of the 1st century before the Common Era and into the 1st century of it, an extraordinarily fertile place for religious thought, a place where Jewish practice and belief were not the unified, settled tradition that later centuries would sometimes imagine them to be, but something much more complicated, much more alive, to disagreement. To understand what the scrolls meant when they were written, and why they survived, and why the world fought so long for the right to read them, it is necessary to understand something about that world. The world their writers were living inside and believed was coming to an end. Judaism in this period was not one thing. It was many things existing in tension with one another. A collection of sects and schools and interpretive traditions, each of which claimed to represent the true inheritance of the covenant, each of which had its own reading of the law and its own understanding of what the coming age would bring. There were Pharisees, whose emphasis on oral tradition and the adaptation of law to everyday life would eventually become the foundation of rabbinic Judaism. There were Sadducees, the priestly aristocracy, who controlled the temple in Jerusalem, and whose relationship with Roman power made them objects of suspicion among more observant Jews. There were zealots and revolutionaries of various kinds for whom the Roman presence was an intolerable desecration of the land, and there were groups who had concluded that the mainstream institutions of Judaism were so corrupted that the only honest response was to withdraw from them entirely. The community at Qumran belonged, in all likelihood, to one of these withdrawing groups, most probably the sect known to later historians as the Essenes. Though the word Essene does not appear in the scrolls themselves, and the identification is not universally accepted. What is clear from the texts they left behind is the shape of their self-understanding. They believed that the Jerusalem temple had fallen into the hands of an illegitimate priesthood, that the religious establishment of the city was corrupt beyond reformation, and that the only authentic Jewish life available was the one they were living out in the desert, governed by strict rules of communal ownership and ritual purity, waiting for the end of the age they were living in and the beginning of the one they believed was coming. They called themselves the community, or the many, or the sons of light, and they divided the world into sons of light and sons of darkness, and they knew which category they occupied. The site at Qumran was almost certainly their home, or one of their homes, for somewhere between 150 and 200 years, from roughly the middle of the 2nd century before the Common Era until the catastrophe that finally ended their community. That catastrophe arrived in the form of the Roman legions who moved through Judea in the War of 66 to 70 of the Common Era, the war that ended with the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, the sacking of the city, and the transformation of Jewish life in ways that are still visible in the world today. The people at Qumran did not survive the war. The archaeological evidence suggests their settlement was destroyed, probably in the year 68 of the Common Era, by Roman troops moving down the western shore of the Dead Sea. But before that end came, they hid their library. This is the extraordinary fact at the center of the whole story. The act that makes everything else possible, facing what they must have known, was a military force capable of destroying everything they had built. The members of the community gathered their scrolls, placed them in clay jars sealed with lids, carried them to the caves in the cliffs above their settlement, and concealed them there. Whether they intended to come back for them or believed the jars would wait for whatever community might eventually inherit their world, we do not know. What we know is that no one came back, and the jars stayed where they had been placed, in the dry dark of the Judean cliffs, for 1900 years. The scrolls inside those jars included texts that would eventually be counted among the most significant manuscripts in the history of religious scholarship. There were copies of books that would later be included in the Hebrew Bible, including what appears to be every book of the Hebrew Scriptures, except perhaps the Book of Esther, predating the previously oldest known copies by roughly 1,000 years. There were the community's own documents, their rule books and their theological writings, their hymns and their biblical commentaries, their apocalyptic visions of the war between light and darkness. There were texts that had been known only in translation, whose original Hebrew and Aramaic had been assumed lost. There were texts that no one had known existed at all. The man who would first understand the significance of what the caves held was not a shepherd and not an archaeologist, but a professor of archaeology at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, a man named Eliezer Sukenak, who was 60 years old in 1947 and who had spent his career studying ancient Jewish inscriptions and artifacts. Sukenak heard through intermediaries that scrolls had appeared on the Bethlehem Antiquities Market, managed to examine photographs of some of the material in late November of that year, and recognized immediately that what he was looking at was very old and very important. He purchased 3 scrolls from a dealer in Bethlehem in early December 1947, working against time because the political situation in Palestine was deteriorating rapidly, and he understood that the borders and the rules governing who could move through them were about to change in ways that could not be predicted. On the other side of what was becoming a conflict was a Syrian Orthodox archbishop named Athanasius Samuel, the metropolitan of the Syrian Orthodox Church in Jerusalem, who had been approached by Bedouin dealers offering scrolls for sale and who had purchased 4 of them without initially understanding what they were. He would spend years trying to find buyers for the scrolls, eventually taking them to the United States, where they were purchased in 1954 through a newspaper advertisement by the Israeli government, acting through an intermediary for $250,000. By that time, the situation on the ground had changed entirely. The State of Israel had come into existence in 1948. The First Arab-Israeli War had ended, and the Jordan River had become a political border that divided the territory where the scrolls had been found between 2 different nations. The systematic excavation of the Qumran site and the surrounding caves began in 1949 and continued through 1956, led by a French Dominican friar and archaeologist named Roland Devaux, who was director of the French Biblical and Archaeological School in Jerusalem, and who would become the central institutional figure in the story of the scrolls' afterlife. Devaux was a formidable scholar, a man of deep learning and considerable personal authority, whose interpretation of the Qumran site as a religious community center has been debated ever since, but who nevertheless made it possible to assemble the basic picture of what had been found. Under his direction, the excavations uncovered 11 caves containing scroll material, the ruins of the Qumran settlement itself, and the beginning of what would eventually become, in the hands of the international team of scholars Deveau assembled, the longest-running editorial project in the history of biblical studies. It is worth pausing here, at the moment before the editorial team is formed, to register what the world held by the middle of the 1950s. It held fragments, tens of thousands of them, the remains of somewhere between 800 and 900 separate scrolls, representing a library that had been intact for nearly 2 millennia and was now dispersed across museum tables in small pieces. It held the possibility of understanding the world of Second Temple Judaism and the world of early Christianity and the world of the Hebrew Bible's transmission, with a clarity that no scholar of the previous generation could have imagined possible. And it held a question that had not yet become urgent, but that was taking shape in the background of every decision that would follow. Who exactly was going to decide what the world was allowed to know about what those fragments said? The answer to that question would shape the next 4 decades, and it would not be the answer anyone outside the inner circle would have chosen. Muhammad Dib was 17 years old, or thereabouts, when he threw a stone into a cave above the Dead Sea and heard a sound that would eventually change the history of scholarship. He was not looking for history. He was a shepherd of the Tamira Bedouin, and he was looking for a goat that had wandered away from his flock. And the caves in the cliffs above the Qumran plateau were the kind of place an animal might have taken shelter. The stone went in through a narrow opening in the rock, and he heard it strike something hard and hollow. A sound that was not the sound of rock on rock. And that sound was interesting enough that he came back the following morning with a friend to investigate. What they found when they lowered themselves through the cave entrance was not a lost animal. It was a narrow chamber in the limestone rock, and along the walls of the chamber were clay jars, tall and cylindrical, sealed with bowl-shaped lids. There were 10 of them, perhaps more, standing in the dim light of the cave as if someone had set them there recently and expected to return. Most of the jars were empty or contained only dark earth and the remnants of cloth, but 2 of them contained something else, and when the shepherds opened the first jar and reached inside, they pulled out a bundle of dark, dry material that turned out, when they unwrapped it, to be several scrolls of parchment tightly rolled, covered in a script they could not read. The young men took the scrolls back to their camp. They hung some of them on a tent pole for a while, not knowing what else to do with them. They were not careless people, and they were not entirely without experience of the antiquities trade that operated quietly and continuously across the region. So they understood that old things could have value, even if the specific nature of this value was not yet clear. Within a few weeks, the scrolls had been taken to Bethlehem, to the shop of a cobbler and antiquities dealer named Khalil Eskander Shahin, known as Kando, who would become a central and permanent figure in the commerce of the Dead Sea Scrolls over the decades that followed. A man whose knowledge of the market and whose network of contacts made him an unavoidable intermediary between the Bedouin who found things in the desert and the scholars and institutions that eventually wanted to acquire them. Kando looked at the scrolls and recognized that they were old and possibly interesting, though he was not a scholar and could not read the script. He passed them on as the market required, and they moved through several hands before arriving at the attention of people who could understand what they were. The route the scrolls took from the cave to the scholarly world was not a clean or dignified one. It was the route of the antiquities trade, which is to say it was tangled, commercially motivated, occasionally dishonest, and entirely characteristic of the way that significant archaeological material has always moved through the world when it is found outside the structures of official excavation. The first scholar to examine the scrolls with genuine understanding was not working through official channels either. Athanasius Samuel was the metropolitan, the senior bishop of the Syrian Orthodox Archdiocese in Jerusalem, and he was a man who combined deep religious learning with a practical interest in antiquities. He was approached in the spring of 1947 by intermediaries acting on Cando's behalf, and after some negotiation he agreed to purchase 4 of the scrolls for a relatively modest sum. He could see that the parchment was old, and the script was old, and the texts were in some combination of Hebrew and Aramaic, but the full significance of what he held was not yet clear to him, and his initial attempts to find scholars who could evaluate the material were met with a curious lack of urgency from the people he approached. The world of biblical scholarship in 1947 had experienced enough sensations and enough disappointments to be cautious about claims of extraordinary discoveries. Ancient manuscripts had a history of turning out to be medieval copies, or forgeries, or items of less significance than their finders believed, and the scholarly community had developed a habit of professional skepticism that was in many ways healthy, and in this particular case very nearly cost the world its first sustained engagement with the most significant manuscript discovery of the modern EZS, Ra. The scrolls sat with Athanasius Samuel for months before anyone who fully understood what they represented had a chance to examine them properly. That examination, when it came from 2 directions simultaneously, on opposite sides of what was rapidly becoming a war. It arrived in the form of 2 very different men, with very different relationships to the material, and very different stakes in what it might turn out to say. Their near-simultaneous recognition of the scroll's significance is one of the stranger coincidences in the story. They're perhaps not so strange when you consider that people who spend their lives studying ancient texts are generally paying close attention to whatever rumors circulate through the antiquities market. Eliezer Sukenik was 60 years old in the winter of 1947. A professor of archaeology at the Hebrew University, who had spent his career building the field of Jewish archaeology from almost nothing, cataloging and interpreting the material evidence of ancient Jewish life in Palestine with the quiet, systematic dedication of a scholar who believes that the objects in the ground are as important the texts in the library. He was also the father of a young military officer named Yigael Yadim, who would later become one of the most significant scroll scholars of the following generation, a fact that gives the story of the scrolls an unusual quality of dynasty, of knowledge passed from parent to child across the catastrophe of a war. Sukenik was a man who had trained himself to read ancient scripts and ancient stones, who had spent decades developing the capacity to look at a fragmentary inscription and understand its age and its significance. And when he received word through an Armenian antiquities dealer that scrolls had appeared on the market that might be very old and very important, he moved quickly and carefully to find out if the claim was true. He arranged to examine photographs on a day in late November 1947, and the photographs told him immediately, with the certainty of a man who had spent decades looking at ancient Jewish inscriptions, that what he was looking at was genuinely ancient, genuinely significant, and unlike anything that had been seen before. He managed to travel to Bethlehem in early December of that year, crossing what was already a tense and dangerous political boundary, to examine and purchase 3 scrolls from a dealer who had access to some of the Qumran material. He came back to Jerusalem understanding that he had just handled something of extraordinary importance, and he wrote in his diary that night with the restraint of a man trained to be careful about his claims, that perhaps This was one of the greatest finds ever made in Palestine. It is worth pausing here in this moment of recognition before the story accelerates into the complications that would define the next 5 decades, to sit with what Sukenik was holding and what it meant. The scroll he had examined most carefully was a copy of the Book of Isaiah, a complete copy, all 66 chapters, written on a continuous strip of parchment that measured about 7.5 meters in length when unrolled, inscribed in a careful, practiced hand that spoke of a scribe who had copied long texts many times before, who understood the work not as an act of individual creativity but as an act of faithful transmission, of preserving something that already existed and passing it forward intact. It was the oldest known copy of any book of the Hebrew Bible, older than any manuscript of any biblical text that had previously been in the hands of scholars by a margin of roughly 1,000 years. The next oldest known copy of Isaiah was a medieval manuscript produced in the 10th century of the Common Era, and the scholars who had been working with that manuscript had been working at a remove from the original tradition that was impossible to fully account for, because 1,000 years of copying by hand across multiple languages and multiple scribal traditions introduces a quantity of small variations and interpretive choices that accumulates into something significant. Between those two manuscripts lay a gap during which every previous scholar had been working without direct access to the oldest textual tradition. And here was the gap suddenly closed, or at least significantly narrowed, by a document that had been sitting in a clay jar in a cave in the Judean desert while the world's scholars worked with what they had. The Isaiah scroll, as it came to be known, turned out to confirm the accuracy of the medieval text to a degree that surprised even the scholars who most hoped for such a result, which was itself a significant finding, a validation of a transmission process that had been questioned but never before subject to this kind of direct verification. But the confirmation of accuracy was only one dimension of what the scroll offered. The other dimension was the variance, the places where the ancient text differed from the medieval one, sometimes in small ways and sometimes in larger ones, the traces of an older textual tradition that the medieval copies had smoothed over or resolved in ways that were now, for the first time, visible as choices rather than as simple facts. The 3 scrolls Sukenik purchased that December were only the beginning. As the months passed and the political situation in Palestine transformed irrevocably into the war that established the State of Israel in 1948, the question of what else might be in the caves above Qumran became simultaneously more urgent and more difficult to pursue. The region around Qumran fell under Jordanian control after the ceasefire, which meant that the excavation of the caves, when it eventually began, would be conducted under Jordanian authority and would involve institutions and scholars with very different relationships to the material than Sukenik had. The Bedouin of the time did not wait for official permission to explore the cliffs. They were experienced desert people with good eyes and a practical understanding of the value of what was in the ground, and in the years between the initial discovery in 1947 and the beginning of the systematic academic excavations in 1949, they found more caves and more scrolls and brought what they found to Kando, who sold it on through the familiar channels. The fragments that arrived on the market in these years were the advance guard of what would eventually be understood as an enormous library, and the scholars who were trying to track their provenance and evaluate their significance were working against time and against the economics of an unregulated market that had no particular reason to wait for them. The formal excavation of the region began in 1949, when the Jordanian Department of Antiquities, working with the French Biblical and Archaeological School in Jerusalem under the direction of Roland de Vaux, began systematically investigating the caves above Qumran and the ruins on the plateau below them. What they found over the next 7 years would establish the full scale of what had been hidden there. Cave 2 was found in 1952, yielding more fragments. Cave 3, in the same year, produced, among other material, one of the most peculiar objects in the entire collection. A scroll made of copper rather than parchment. The Copper Scroll, which described in its somewhat cryptic language a list of hidden treasures whose existence and location remain debated to this day. Cave 4, found in 1952 as well, proved to be the most significant of all. A cave that had apparently served as the community's primary library and that contained fragments from perhaps 600 different scrolls, the bulk of the collection that would eventually be assigned to the international team for publication. Cave 4 deserves a moment of its own, because it is in many ways the heart of the whole problem that the scroll story would become. It was not a sealed chamber with intact jars. It was an open cave, accessible from the outside, and the scrolls that had been stored there had been exposed over the centuries to moisture and insects and the ordinary processes of decay in a way that the scrolls in the better sealed caves had not. What Cave 4 contained, when the excavators reached it, was not scrolls but fragments. Thousands and thousands of fragments. Shreds of parchment that had once been whole texts and were now the scattered remnants of them, lying in layers in the dust of the cave floor. Some of the fragments were large enough to include several lines of text. Many were small enough to contain a single word. Some were so small and so damaged that their connection to any identifiable text would require years of careful scholarly work to establish. The task of sorting, identifying, photographing, and eventually publishing the Cave 4 material was the task that would consume the international editorial team for the better part of 4 decades. And it was a task so large and so demanding that it is possible to understand, at least at the beginning, why the people responsible for it did not treat it as something that could be finished quickly. Tour. The work of retrieving and identifying the cave material was painstaking and often heartbreaking. The scrolls had spent 1900 years in conditions that were good for preservation by ancient standards but not perfect by modern ones, and the larger intact scrolls were the exception rather than the rule. Most of what the caves contained was fragments, some of them large enough to include multiple columns of text, many of them small enough to contain only a few words, some of them reduced by time and the weight of collapsed soil to scraps, so tiny that their connection to the texts around them could be established only by patient scholarly work over many years. The team that would eventually be responsible for this work was assembling itself during the years of excavation. Brought together by devocs from universities and research institutions in half a dozen countries, a group of serious scholars who understood they had been handed one of the most important editorial tasks in the history of their discipline. By 1956, when the last of the 11 scroll caves had been identified and excavated, the shape of what had been found was finally clear, or as clear as it would be for a long time. 11 caves, fragments from somewhere approaching 900 separate scrolls, a library that had been assembled, copied, and maintained by a Jewish community in the Judean desert sometime in the final centuries before the Common Era and the first century of it, and hidden in the cliffs when that community understood it was about to be destroyed. The discovery had not been a single moment, but a decade-long accumulation, a series of finds, each one adding to and complicating the picture, until the scholarly world found itself holding something so large and so significant that the question of what to do with it was not a simple one. It is worth noting, before we move forward into the decades that followed, that the world in which this discovery was made was a world that did not yet have photocopying machines in widespread use, that did not have digital photography, They did not have the databases and computational tools that would later make the management of a large body of fragmentary text an entirely different kind of problem than it had been. The scholars who were assigned fragments in the early 1950s were working with pencils and photographs and their own eyes, and the task before them was genuinely enormous, genuinely demanding of the kind of expertise and patience that takes a career to develop, and genuinely unlike anything that had been attempted before. This does not justify everything that followed, but it provides the context in which the decisions that shaped the next 4 decades were made, and it is worth holding that context alongside the judgment, because the story is complicated enough that it deserves to be understood whole. The discovery was not a single moment, but a decade-long accumulation, and by the time it was over, the scholarly world was holding somewhere in the region of 50,000 separate fragments, representing a library that had been kept in the dark for 2 millennia. It had no clear idea yet of exactly what it had, or how long it would take to find out, or what the world would eventually have to do in order to compel the people responsible for the finding out to share what they learned. What it did have, and what it understood even in these early years, was the recognition that the caves above the Dead Sea had preserved something that no amount of scholarship could have produced from the materials previously available. A window into a world that had been closed for 1900 years, and that the people now holding the key to that window had been given one of the most significant responsibilities in the history of their discipline. And so by the middle of the 1950s, the world knew roughly what it had. 11 caves, tens of thousands of fragments, a ruined community site in the desert above the Dead Sea, and a collection of texts that scholars were only beginning to understand the scale of. We can move forward now, a few years, into the decades when the excitement of discovery was replaced by something quieter and more complicated, when the question stopped being what the scrolls were and became, instead, who was going to decide what they meant. A small group of men had been given that responsibility, and the story of what they did with it is not quite the story anyone expected. The Palestine Archaeological Museum in East Jerusalem sat in a quiet neighborhood not far from the old city walls. A handsome building of pale stone that housed, among its other collections, a working room where the Dead Sea Scroll fragments were laid out on long tables under plates of glass. This was the scriptorium, though the word is perhaps too grand for what it actually was. A room where a small number of scholars worked, in the years following the main excavations, on the task of sorting and identifying and beginning to transcribe the fragments that had been recovered from the caves. The room was cool and relatively quiet, the fragments visible through the glass on their tables, and the scholars who sat at those tables understood themselves to be doing something that had not been done before and would not need to be done again. The work of first contact with texts that had been hidden for nearly 2,000 years. Roland Devore had assembled his team with care. He had drawn on scholars from the École Biblique in Jerusalem, his own institution, and from universities and research centers in France, Germany, England, and the United States. The team was small, perhaps 8 or 9 people in its initial configuration, and it was almost exclusively male and almost exclusively Christian, a fact that would later be noted with considerable frequency by critics who pointed out the oddness of entrusting the primary scholarly access to the oldest known Jewish manuscripts to a group that did not include, in its early years, a single Jewish manuscript to a group that did not include, in its early years, color. The reasons for this composition were partly historical and partly practical, connected to the political situation in Jerusalem and the institutional affiliations of the scholars available, but the fact itself remained, and it colored the way the team and its work were perceived from the very beginning. The assignment of fragments to individual scholars was the structural decision that would, more than any other single choice, shape the history of the scroll publication project and its eventual failure. De Vock divided the Cave 4 material among the team members, giving each scholar responsibility for a portion of the fragments, with the understanding that each scholar would study his assigned material, prepare a critical edition, and publish it in the official series, The Discoveries in the Judean Desert volumes, that the project had established as its publication outlet. The logic of the arrangement was straightforward enough. The fragments were diverse in their content and in the languages and scripts they used, and the different specializations of the different scholars made a division of labor not only sensible but necessary. What the arrangement created, however, and what no one appears to have fully thought through at the time, was a system in which each scholar's assigned fragments became, in effect, his personal intellectual property. The academic norms of the period were clear on this point. You did not publish another scholar's material without permission, and you did not have access to unpublished material that had been assigned to someone else. These norms existed for good reasons in the context of ordinary scholarly work, where they protected the investment of time and labor that original research required, and prevented the kind of exploitation of junior scholars by senior ones that had been common in earlier generations. Applied to the Dead Sea Scrolls, however, they produced a situation in which the most important body of newly discovered ancient texts in the modern era was effectively partitioned into private estates, each controlled by a single scholar who could work on it at whatever pace he chose, grant or withhold access to other researchers at his discretion, and publish or withhold access to other researchers at his discretion, and publish or not publish. The rest of the world had no mechanism to influence. The three figures who would most shape the fate of the scroll publication project in the decades that followed were Roland de Vos himself, the architect of the original arrangement, whose decisions in the 1950s established the framework within which everything else would unfold; John Allegro, the British scholar who was the team's most volatile and eventually most publicly embarrassing member; and John Strugnell, the young Englishman who joined the team in 1954 and would eventually rise to become its chief editor. Each of these men contributed something distinctive to the story that the project would become, and each of them illustrates, in his own way, a different aspect of how the arrangement that began as a reasonable scholarly division of labor transformed into something that the scholarly world outside the inner circle found increasingly difficult to accept. To understand what happened, it is necessary to understand something about each of them, because the story of the scroll monopoly is not a simple story of villainy, but a more complicated story about how people who are genuinely capable and genuinely dedicated to their work can, under certain institutional conditions, arrive at positions that look, from outside those conditions, like something close to obstruction. Allegro arrived on the team with energy and intelligence and a gift for the kind of popular engagement with scholarship that was, in the 1950s and 60s, beginning to reach a mass audience through television and popular publishing. He was the first member of the team to appear on British television to discuss the scrolls, and his broadcasts attracted significant public interest, which was itself a source of tension with colleagues who felt that the appropriate venue for scholarly communication was the scholarly publication, not the BBC. Allegro's public career as a scroll commentator accelerated rapidly and in increasingly alarming directions. He became convinced that the scrolls contained evidence of a direct connection between the Qumran community and the origins of early Christianity, a connection that, in his reading, would significantly undermine the traditional understanding of Jesus as a unique historical figure rather than a figure whose role had been shaped and, in some respects, anticipated by earlier sectarian traditions. His colleagues on the team disagreed with his interpretations, often forcefully and sometimes publicly. The disagreement was partly scholarly about the actual content of the texts and the validity of Allegro's readings, and partly temperamental about how the team's work should be presented and to whom. But the Allegro episode introduced into the story of the Scroll Project an element that would never entirely leave it: the suspicion, held by a growing segment of the public, that the scrolls contained material that powerful institutions had reason to suppress, and that the slowness of publication was connected to this suppression in ways that the scholarly establishment was not willing to acknowledge. Take a moment here before the story moves into the darker decades to consider what the Scroll team was actually doing in these years and what it was not doing. The scholars assigned to the K4 fragments were doing genuine scholarly work, difficult and painstaking and requiring exactly the expertise and patience that Duval had selected them for. They were working on texts that were fragmentary and damaged, and written in scripts and dialects that required specialized knowledge to read. And they were working without the computational tools that later scholars would take for granted. Tools that made the management of large bodies of fragmentary text an entirely different enterprise than it had been in the 1950s. The work was slow because it was genuinely difficult, and the scholars doing it were not, in the early years, conscious of having made any choice that required justification. What they were not doing, and what would eventually become the central accusation against them, was publishing. The discoveries in the Judean Desert series had begun to appear in 1955, and the early volumes, covering the more complete scrolls from caves other than Cave 4, were produced within a reasonable time frame. But the Cave 4 material, by far the largest and most significant portion of the collection, appeared at a pace that became progressively harder to defend. A decade passed, then two, and the bulk of the fragments assigned to the team remained unpublished, unavailable to any researcher outside the inner circle, locked away in a museum that was itself inaccessible to Israeli scholars after 1967, when the Six-Day War brought East Jerusalem under Israeli control, and the scroll fragments were moved to the Rockefeller Museum, whose Jordanian trustees retied administrative control of the collection. The political geography of the scrolls added another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation. The fragments had been found in territory that was Jordanian in 1947 and became Israeli in 1967, and the international team had been constituted under Jordanian auspices and remained under the jurisdiction of the Jordanian-administered Rockefeller Museum, even after Israeli scholars and institutions would have been the natural partners for a project whose subject matter was so directly connected to Jewish history and Jewish texts. Israeli scholars of the stature and qualifications necessary to work on the fragments were, for years, effectively excluded from the project simply by the institutional arrangements that had been established before the political geography changed. John Stragnall joined DeVoe's team at the age of 23, fresh from Oxford, already recognized as a prodigiously gifted linguist with a particular mastery of the ancient Semitic languages that the scrolls required. He was assigned responsibility for a substantial portion of the K4 material, including texts that would eventually prove to be among the most significant in the entire collection, and he settled into the slow, meticulous work of fragment identification, transcription, and interpretation that the assignment required. The qualities that made him excellent at this work: his perfectionism, his unwillingness to publish anything he considered preliminary or insufficiently prepared, his conviction that the standards of the field demanded a depth of engagement that could not be hurried, were also the qualities that made him, over the course of the following decades, one of the primary reasons the project failed to meet any reasonable expectation of timely completion. He was not a lazy man. He was a man who understood thoroughness as the only acceptable standard. and who had been placed in a situation in which thoroughness, pursued without institutional constraint or external accountability, could take as long as it chose. His early years on the team coincided with the period when the scroll project still had the quality of genuine excitement, when the fragments were being sorted and identified and the shape of the library was becoming clearer, and when the publications that had appeared were being received with the enthusiasm of a scholarly community that understood it was witnessing something rare. The first volumes of Discoveries in the Judean Desert appeared to significant scholarly attention, and the figures involved in the project, DeVoe chief among them, had the standing and the credibility that came from association with the discovery of this magnitude. It was a good time to be a scroll scholar, and the problems that would later define the project's reputation were not yet visible as problems, because they required decades of accumulating non-publication to become clearly what they were. The Allegro disruption, when it came, was important not because Allegro's specific interpretations were correct, most of them were not, but because it introduced into the public consciousness the idea that the scrolls might contain material that the team or institutions connected to the team had reasons to keep from the world. Allegro published a popular book in 1956, and then a more sensational one in 1970, entitled The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, which argued for a connection between the origins of Christianity and a fertility cult centered on the ritual use of hallucinogenic fungi. The book was rejected almost universally by scholars, and most of his colleagues on the scroll team publicly dissociated themselves from his views. But the pattern it established of a scroll insider claiming suppressed revelations remained in the popular imagination long after Allegro himself had been discredited. The conspiracy theory of the scrolls was partly Allegro's creation, and it was a creation that the team's subsequent behavior did nothing to dispel. Take a moment here, before the story moves into the long middle period, when the patience of the outside world began finally to give out, to consider the specific texture of what it meant to be a researcher who needed access to the unpublished fragments and could not get it. Imagine being a scholar whose work required engagement with texts from the Second Temple period, texts that were directly relevant to your research, and knowing that those texts existed, had been excavated and photographed and assigned to individual scholars, but were simply unavailable to you. You could write to the scholar responsible for your needed fragment, and sometimes that letter would be answered, and sometimes it would not. And sometimes an answer would arrive years later, and sometimes you would discover that the fragment you needed had not yet been transcribed, or had been transcribed but not yet analyzed, or had been analyzed but not yet prepared for publication, and that the scholar responsible was not yet ready to share his work in any form that would allow you to proceed with yours. The norms of the field gave the individual scroll team members the right to withhold this access, and the institutional arrangements gave them the power to enforce it, and the combination of right and power produced over the decades a situation in which a growing number of scholars found their research stalled or redirected by the absence of material that, in any reasonable conception of the pub-like interest, should have been available to them. The toll this took on individual careers and on the collective advancement of knowledge in the field is genuinely difficult to calculate, but it was real, and the people who paid it were not the scroll team's members, but the scholars outside it, the work that could not be done, the dissertations that had to be abandoned or reframed, the papers that could not be written because their authors could not access the primary sources, the questions that could not be asked because the texts that might answer them were locked away in a museum in Jerusalem. None of this appears in the official record of the Scroll Project's history, but it forms a significant part of what the monopoly actually cost. When Roland DeVos died in 1971, he had published relatively little of the Cave 4 material assigned to him directly, and his death created a vacancy in the leadership of the project that took time to fill and introduced additional delay. The project that succeeded him was no less dedicated in its rhetoric to eventual publication, and no more effective in achieving it. The structure DeVos had established had been designed around his personal authority and his personal relationships with the team members, and without that authority, the structure became harder to manage and easier for individuals within it to use as a framework for continued indefinite tenure over their assigned fragments. The 2 decades after DeVos' death were the decades in which the patience of the outside world eroded most significantly, because they were the decades in which the people waiting could do the arithmetic. The scrolls had been found in 1947. By 1981, 34 years had passed. By 1987, 40 years. The standard justifications, the complexity of the material, the need for absolute precision, the absence of adequate resources had been offered so many times that they had lost their capacity to persuade anyone who was not already persuaded. The field changed around the scroll team. New methods had been developed. New scholars had emerged who were qualified to work on the material and eager to do so, and the team had not changed with it, had not opened its assignments to new participants, had not established a realistic timeline, had not found a way to accelerate a process that had been moving at the same pace for 3.5 decades. By the time Roland DeVos died, the team had become an institution unto itself, with all the self-protective instincts that institutions develop, and no one who was not already inside it had yet found a way to change that from the outside. The arguments for change were accumulating, the critics were becoming more organized and more vocal, and the case for opening the archive was, to almost everyone outside the team, entirely obvious. What remained to be found was not a better argument, but a sufficient lever, something that could move an institution that had survived for decades precisely by being unmovable. The question of why the publication took so long has answers at several levels, and the honest version of the story holds all of them simultaneously. There was the genuine difficulty of the material, which was real and should not be dismissed. There was the absence of the computational and photographic tools that would later transform the management of fragmentary texts, which was also real. There was the particular culture of biblical scholarship in the 1950s and 60s, which valued careful preparation over rapid publication, and had not yet developed the norms of open access that later scholarship would come to consider essential. And there was, underneath all of these legitimate factors, something harder to name but equally real: a reluctance to let go, a habit of institutional self-protection, a calculation, perhaps not always fully conscious, that the longer the material remained unpublished, the more essential to it the team remained, and that the moment of final publication was also the moment of the team's dissolution. Human institutions are very good at not ending when their original purpose has been served, or when the people outside them would prefer they did. The scroll team, by the time it had survived into its 3rd decade, had become exactly this kind of institution, one that had developed the self-preserving qualities that organizations develop over time, and that had found in those qualities a set of reasons, always available and always apparently reasonable, for continuing to exist in the form it had always taken, rather than changing in the ways the world was asking it to change. Roland DeVos had died, and the team had continued. The political geography of the region had transformed twice, and the team had continued. The field of biblical scholarship had developed new methods, new approaches, and new standards of practice, and the team had continued, more or less as it had always been, for 20 years, then 30, then 40. Continuing, the museum in East Jerusalem was still there, the fragments still on their tables, the scholars still doing their work, and the world outside was still waiting. But the quality of the waiting had changed, as the quality of waiting always changes when it has been going on long enough. we need to move forward now, into the long middle of the story, into the years when the scroll team's possession of its material began to look less like stewardship and more like something it would take an outside force to break. The lever that was needed had not yet been found, but the people who would eventually find it were already at work. Picture a researcher in the 1970s or the early 1980s sitting at a desk in the university library somewhere, perhaps in England, perhaps in the United States, working on a question about Jewish practice in the Second Temple period, or the development of early Christian theology, or the textual history of a particular book of the Hebrew Bible. She has read everything published about the Dead Sea Scrolls, which means she has read a small fraction of what the caves at Qumran actually contained, because the fraction that has been published is genuinely small relative to the total. She knows that the unpublished fragments include material directly relevant to her question. She knows the name of the scholar to whom that material has been assigned. She writes him a letter, careful and collegial, explaining her research and her need and asking whether some arrangement might be made for her to see the relevant fragments, or at minimum to receive some indication of their content. What happened to that letter depended on which scholar received it and what mood he was in. Sometimes a response came relatively quickly, and it was not encouraging, explaining that the material in question was not yet ready for consultation by outside researchers, and that the scholar hoped to have it prepared for publication at some point in the future. No specific date given. Sometimes the letter was not answered at all. Sometimes an answer came months or years later, unhelpful in substance but written in a tone of professional courtesy that made it difficult to frame as a refusal without seeming to mischaracterize it. The accumulation of these non-answers across the careers of a generation of scholars represented a systematic failure of the stewardship that the scroll team had been entrusted to exercise, and the people at its receiving end understood it as exactly that, even if they could not say so publicly without risking their professional relationships with the very insiders whose goodwill they might one day need. The voice that rose most consistently to name this failure as a failure, and to do so in terms that reached beyond the specialist community to a general audience, belonged to Geza Vermes, a Hungarian-born scholar whose life story carried its own freight of history and loss. Vermes had been born Jewish in 1924, had converted to Catholicism during the Second World War in circumstances that involved both genuine religious conviction and the practical matter of survival, had been ordained as a priest, and had subsequently left the priesthood, returned to Judaism, and rebuilt a career as one of the foremost scholars of ancient Jewish texts in the English-speaking world. He held a position at Oxford. He wrote with unusual clarity for a general audience as well as for specialists, and he understood from inside the experience of the Catholic scholarly world that he had once inhabited something about the institutional dynamics that shaped the Scroll Project's behavior. Vermes published his own translations of the available scrolls in a series of editions that began in 1962 and were updated repeatedly over the following decades, making the published material accessible to readers who lacked the specialist knowledge to engage with the critical editions. These translations were significant in themselves, but their larger significance was the demonstration they constituted of how much material had been published, and by implication, how much had not. A reader of Vermes knew what the world had access to, and a scholar of Vermes knew what it was missing, and the gap between the two was, by the 1980s, an argument in itself against the pace of the official publication project. Herschel Shanks was not a biblical scholar. He was a lawyer who had founded the Biblical Archaeology Review in 1975 as a publication dedicated to making the findings of biblical archaeology accessible to an interested general readership, and he had built it into the most widely read publication in its field By the time the scroll controversy began to heat up in the 1980s, he had a journalist's instinct for a story, a lawyer's instinct for the systemic dimension of a grievance, and an editor's instinct for the combination of these two qualities in a subject that his readers would find both significant and infuriating. The Dead Sea Scrolls monopoly was exactly that subject, and Shanks pursued it with an energy and persistence that the scroll team found increasingly difficult to manage and eventually impossible to ignore. The Biblical Archaeology Review became, through Shanks's editorial direction, a sustained campaign for open access to the scroll material. Shanks published interviews with scholars who had been denied access, giving them a public forum that the norms of academic courtesy had previously prevented them from using. He published analyses of what the publication backlog actually represented in terms of the quantity and significance of unpublished material, making visible in specific terms what the abstract complaint of delay actually meant for the state of scholarship in the field. He published the responses of the official team, which had the unfortunate quality of sounding, when laid out in print beside the evidence of what had not been published in 4 decades, somewhat less than persuasive. He editorialized forcefully and repeatedly, and the tone of his editorials, which combined moral seriousness with a willingness to name names that the more cautious academic culture found uncomfortable, made him a figure whom the scroll team's defenders characterized as a sensationalist and whom the scroll team's critics regarded as the most effective advocate they had. He was, in the specific context of this specific controversy, exactly the right kind of irritant, persistent enough to keep the issue alive in public consciousness during the years when the academic establishment might otherwise have allowed it to subside back into the quiet world of specialist complaint. Pause here, in the long middle of the waiting, and consider what the scroll team itself would have said if you had asked its members in the 1980s to explain the situation. They would have pointed, correctly, to the genuine difficulty of the work, to the condition of the material, to the limitations of the resources available to them, to the extraordinary precision that the preparation of a critical edition demanded, and to the institutional context in which their work had been conducted, a context that had not provided them with the professional support, the staffing, or the facilities that a project of this scale actually required. Some of these arguments were valid. The work was genuinely difficult. The resources had genuinely been inadequate. The institutional structures had genuinely failed to provide what was needed. What these arguments could not account for, and what the team's defenders were never able to explain satisfactorily, was the access question. Publication speed was one issue, and a legitimate one to debate, but the refusal to allow other qualified scholars to examine the unpublished fragments or even to examine the photographs was a separate and harder question, because it had nothing to do with the pace of publication and everything to do with the desire to control who knew what. The fragments in the Palestine Archaeological Museum had been photographed in a systematic way, and those photographs existed, and the photographs could in principle have been made available to qualified scholars without prejudicing the official publication project in any meaningful way. The team's consistent refusal to permit this access was the action that most clearly revealed the monopoly for what it was. The public debate about the scrolls in the 1980s was not helped by the atmosphere of conspiracy theory that had built up around the question of what the scrolls contained. The Al-Akher episode had seeded the idea that the scrolls held dramatic revelations that institutional religion could not afford to acknowledge, and that idea had been nurtured by a series of popular books and articles that proposed, with varying degrees of seriousness, that the Vatican was suppressing evidence that would overturn Christian doctrine, that the scroll team members were agents of institutional religion, protecting their institutions from the consequences of authentic historical evidence, or that the scrolls contained texts that directly contradicted the gospel accounts of Jesus' life in ways that official Christianity could not afford to acknowledge. None of these theories was well supported by evidence, and the scholars who had examined the published material knew this. But the absence of the unpublished material created a space in which the theories could flourish because the one definitive refutation, the actual content of the unpublished texts, was precisely what was being withheld. It was into this atmosphere of building pressure, public frustration, and persistent conspiracy theory that John Strugnell was appointed chief editor of the publication project in 1987. He was by this point a man of 56, deeply knowledgeable about the scroll material, genuinely committed to the project of its publication, and in possession of the longest continuous institutional memory of any surviving team member. He was also a man whose personal behavior had become increasingly erratic over the preceding decade, whose health was not good, and whose relationship with the institutional and public dimensions of his role was complicated in ways that would, within 3 years of his appointment, produce the crisis that finally cracked the monopoly open. The appointment of Strugnell as chief editor was not irrational. He was the most qualified person available in terms of his knowledge of the material and his experience with the project, but it was the appointment of a man who was temperamentally unsuited to managing the political and public relations dimensions of a role that, by 1987, required as much skill in those areas as it did in the scholarly ones. The critics of the Scroll Project were organized and vocal and had the sympathy of a significant portion of the academic world, and the case for dramatic acceleration of publication had never been stronger. What the project needed in 1987 was a leader who understood that the world had run out of patience and that the only way forward was radical transparency. What it got was John Strugnell, who understood thoroughness and scholarship and the demands of the text, and who would prove, in the 3 years that followed, to be both the ablest person available for the job and the worst possible person to carry it through. The mismatch between what the role required and what Strugnell was capable of providing was not invisible to everyone at the time, but the institutional logic that had shaped the project for 3 decades continued to operate. And that logic favored seniority, expertise, and continuity of engagement with the material over the political and public skills that a different kind of leader might have brought. Strugnell did not, in the first years of his tenure as chief editor, show any signs of understanding the depth of the crisis he had inherited. He spoke about the publication project with the confidence of a man who believed that the standards he had spent his career defending were worth defending, and that the critics who called for open access were motivated more by impatience and self-interest than by legitimate scholarly concern. He was dismissive of Shanks and of the Biblical Archaeology Review campaign, treating its pressure as the kind of popular agitation that serious scholars were entitled to ignore. He spoke about the scrolls with the proprietary authority of someone who had been living with the material for 30 years and who found the suggestion that other scholars had an equal right to it both intellectually incomprehensible and personally offensive. In the meantime, the world outside the inner circle was finding other ways to approach the problem. The key figure in what would become the first serious breach of the monopoly was a concordance, a comprehensive index of every word in the unpublished K4 texts, organized by context, that had been compiled years earlier as a working tool for the Scroll team members. The concordance was not itself a publication of the texts, because it indexed words rather than reproducing complete passages. But it was comprehensive enough that a sufficiently skilled scholar could, in principle, reconstruct substantial portions of the unpublished texts by working back from the concordance entries. A copy of this concordance had made its way outside the official circle, and its existence was known to a number of scholars who understood its potential significance. The Israeli Antiquities Authority, which had taken over administrative responsibility for the scrolls from the Rockefeller Museum in 1966 after the Six-Day War, was also under increasing pressure to accelerate publication and open access, pressure that came both from the Israeli scholarly community and from the international criticism that had been mounting for years. In 1990, the authority took the significant step of expanding the editorial team, bringing in new members who were not part of the original inner circle, with the stated intention of accelerating the pace of publication. This was the most substantive institutional response to the access problem that had yet been attempted, and it represented a genuine acknowledgement that the existing arrangement was not working. It also came too late, and was in any case overshadowed almost immediately by the events that followed. The crisis that Strugnall had been presiding over was not merely a scholarly one. It had been building for decades, fed by the conspiracy theories that Allegro had helped to create and that the team's secretiveness had done nothing to dispel. And by the time Strugnall was at the center of it, the combination of genuine scholarly grievance and popular imagination about hidden revelations had produced a public atmosphere that was genuinely dangerous for the project's credibility. Any significant scandal involving a senior team member would not be contained by the normal mechanisms of academic dispute resolution. It would break into the open in a way that the decades of internal management had prevented. And when it did, it would bring with it all the accumulated pressure of 40 years of waiting. What happened in late 1990 was of a different character than the academic dispute about access and publication that had defined the controversy up to that point. Strugnall gave an extended interview to an Israeli journalist, an interview that ranged widely across his views on the scrolls and on the religious traditions connected to them. And in the course of that interview, he made statements about Judaism that were, by any reasonable reading, anti-Semitic in their content and tone. He described Judaism as a fossil, as a religion that should not have survived after the rise of Christianity. And he made these remarks not in the heat of argument or under provocation, but in the considered context of an extended intellectual conversation with a reporter who was writing a profile of him for an Israeli newspaper. The interview was published. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The Israeli scholarly and political community responded with a speed and force that left no room for the usual academic mechanisms of private negotiation and managed withdrawal. Strugnall was removed from the editorship of the publication project within weeks. The removal was publicly acknowledged and publicly explained, and with his removal, the institutional structure that had maintained the monopoly for 40 years lost a figure who had been its most determined defender and its most publicly identified representative, and the combination of forces that had been building outside the inner circle for years finally had the opening it needed. The critics of the monopoly, the scholars who had been writing letters and publishing criticisms and campaigning through the Biblical Archaeology Review for more than a decade, had not caused Strugnall's fall. That fall had been of his own making, in a way that none of them could have predicted or engineered, but they were ready when it happened, because they had been preparing for exactly this kind of opening for years, and the tools they needed to take advantage of it were already assembled. The concordance was already outside the team's control. The plans for what to do with it were already in place. What Strugnall's removal provided was not a new opportunity, but the removal of the last obstacle. And within months of his departure, the world that the scroll team had worked for 4 decades to hold at bay came through the door. The years of silence had ended. The years of waiting had ended. What had not yet ended was the question that the waiting had been building toward. What exactly had been worth waiting so long to conceal? The answer to that question, when it finally became available, was both less dramatic and more significant than 40 years of speculation had prepared anyone to expect. And it is the question that this story has been building towards since the first cave opened above the Dead Sea in the winter of 1947. And so the long middle of the story had ended, not with a resolution but with a rupture. And the rupture had come, as ruptures usually do, not from the direction anyone was watching. We can move forward now, into the compressed and remarkable sequence of months in 1991, when a monopoly that had survived 40 years of sustained pressure simply gave way all at once, its various supporting structures failing in rapid succession, each failure making the next one easier. What follows is the most dramatic passage in this story, and it is dramatic not because it involves violence or conspiracy, but because it involves something rarer, a situation in which persistence, ingenuity, and the weight of accumulated public outrage finally proved to be enough. The autumn of 1990 was when the sequence began, with Strugnell's removal, and it was the moment when everyone who had been watching the scroll controversy understood that the situation had fundamentally changed. The interview had been published in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, and the statements it contained were not ambiguous. Strugnell had described Judaism as a horrible religion that should not have survived the rise of Christianity, had characterized Jewish practice as a fossil that had outlived whatever legitimacy it once possessed, and had offered these opinions not as the off-the-record musings of a man caught in an unguarded moment, but as considered positions in a formal interview with a journalist who had come specifically to discuss his work and his views. The statements were read in Israel and throughout the international scholarly community, with a combination of shock and, in some quarters, the exhausted recognition that this was the man who had been guarding the most important collection of ancient Jewish texts in the world for more than 30 years. The team had lost its chief editor under circumstances that made any return to the old posture of dignified scholarly authority essentially impossible. The justifications that had sustained the monopoly for 4 decades, the complexity of the work, the need for precision, the inadequacy of resources, all of which had been advanced with a certain scholarly gravitas that made them hard to dismiss entirely, could no longer be delivered from behind the credibility that the institution had previously possessed. Something had shifted in the way the scroll team was perceived, and that shift was permanent. The Israeli Antiquities Authority moved with uncharacteristic speed to address the crisis, bringing in Emmanuel Tov, a respected Israeli textual scholar, to replace Strugnell as editor-in-chief, and announcing an expanded team with a mandate to accelerate publication. These were substantive changes, not merely cosmetic ones, and under different circumstances they might have been sufficient to restore confidence in the project's management. But the circumstances of late 1990 and early 1991 were not different. They were exactly the circumstances they were, and the changes came too late to prevent what was already in motion. The external forces that had been building for years had acquired a momentum that institutional reform could not redirect, and the people in positions of institutional authority were about to discover that they had, at some point in the recent past, lost the ability to shape the story they were part of. The Concordance had been compiled in the 1950s and 60s as a practical tool for the team's own use. A comprehensive index of every word in the unpublished Cave 4 texts. The value of such an index to scholars working on a large body of fragmentary material is obvious. It allows you to find all the occurrences of a word or phrase across the entire collection, to identify patterns, to track vocabulary, to see the linguistic relationships between different texts. The compilation had been an enormous undertaking in its own right, requiring systematic weeding of every fragment and careful recording of every word in its textual context. and the resulting document ran to multiple volumes. It had been compiled without any expectation that it would ever leave the team's hands, and for decades it had circulated only among team members and a very small number of trusted associates. The assumption that it was secure within this circle turned out, as such assumptions often do, to have been optimistic. A copy had escaped at some point and through channels that have never been entirely clear, and by the early 1990s it was in the hands of scholars who understood very precisely what could be done with it. Ben Zion Wacholder was a professor at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, a Talmudic scholar of considerable distinction who had been following the scroll controversy with increasing frustration for years. Martin Abegg was his graduate student, working under Wacholder's supervision on material that touched directly on the questions the unpublished fragments might illuminate, if only they could be examined together. In the spring and summer of 1991, they used the escaped concordance as the basis for a computerized reconstruction of the unpublished texts, working with the specific methodical patience that the task demanded, cross-referencing word occurrences against known textual patterns and building up, passage by passage, a version of texts that had never been officially released. The logic of the reconstruction was that if you knew every word in a text and the context in which each word appeared, you had, in principle, enough information to reconstruct the text itself, at least in substantial outline. The process required not just the concordance, but also deep knowledge of the linguistic and literary conventions of the relevant period. The ability to recognize when a word cluster pointed to a known genre or formula and when it suggested something new, and the patience to work through thousands of entries systematically rather than selectively. The results were not perfect, because a concordance is not a manuscript, and the gaps and uncertainties that any reconstruction must carry were real and acknowledged, but they were accurate enough to constitute, for the first time, a usable version of texts that the team had kept from the world for 40 years, accurate enough to let scholars begin asking questions that the official monopoly had prevented for decades. Wacholder and Abegg published the reconstruction in 1991 through the Biblical Archaeology Review Press, with Shanks's enthusiastic editorial involvement and his characteristic willingness to move quickly once a decision had been made. The publication was announced, the team's response arrived, and the response was both immediate and, in retrospect, entirely counterproductive. The official position was that the publication was an infringement of the team's intellectual property rights over the unpublished texts, and that legal action was being considered. This response, which would have been problematic in any year, was catastrophic in 1991, when the team's public standing had already been severely damaged by the Strognall affair, and when the intellectual property claim was, in any case, legally dubious in ways that the team's own lawyers could not have been enthusiastic about pursuing. The legal threat was a tactical error that revealed the extent to which the team had lost touch with the public dimension of its situation. The claim that the unpublished contents of 2,000-year-old religious texts were the intellectual property of the scholars assigned to study them was not a claim that played well in the court of public opinion, and it played even less well in the actual courts, where the legal basis for intellectual property claims over ancient texts of this kind was, at best, unclear. The threat was made, it was widely reported, it was widely ridiculed, and it was never followed through. What it accomplished, beyond demonstrating the team's desperation, was to focus public attention even more sharply on the absurdity of the access restrictions and to accelerate the momentum that was already building toward the complete opening of the archive. Hold that image for a moment, because it captures something essential about the final stage of the monopoly. The team was still operating on the assumption that the same institutional authority that had protected it for 40 years would continue to protect it, still reaching for the tools of formal academic power, still treating the question of access to the scrolls as a matter to be settled within the structures of scholarly convention. What it had not fully understood, or had understood but could not accept, was that those structures had already ceased to function as protection. The credibility that gives institutions their authority is not a fixed quantity. It depletes, and the scroll team, by 1991, had depleted its supply. The second breach came from California. The Huntington Library in San Marino held a duplicate set of photographs of the unpublished Cave 4 fragments, photographs that had been deposited there years earlier as a form of insurance against loss or damage to the originals. The existence of these photographs was known, but the Huntington had previously respected the access restrictions that governed the project. In September of 1991, the Huntington's director announced that the library would make its photographic archive available to all qualified researchers unconditionally, without restrictions and without reference to the claims of the official editorial team. The announcement was made without prior consultation with the Israeli Antiquities Authority or with the scroll team. It was simply done. The Huntington's decision was the clearest single act of institutional defection in the entire history of the controversy, because the Huntington was itself a significant scholarly institution, not a rogue operator or a sensationalist press, and its willingness to act unilaterally against the wishes of the official project represented a judgment about the public interest that was both considered and irreversible. The day after the announcement, researchers began arriving at the Huntington to examine photographs of fragments they had been waiting years, or in some cases decades, to see. The Israeli Antiquities Authority, faced with the practical reality that the photographs were now available regardless of its position, announced within weeks that it was removing the access restrictions entirely, and that the unpublished fragments would henceforth be available to all qualified scholars. There was also, in this same compressed period, the work of Robert Eisenman and James Robinson, who had independently obtained a different set of photographs of the unpublished material and published them without authorization in 2 large volumes that appeared in 1991. Eisenman was a scholar of early Christianity who had been arguing for years that the scroll team's restricted access had prevented a full evaluation of the scroll's significance for the origins of Christianity, and his views on what the scrolls would reveal were, to put it gently, not shared by most of his colleagues in the field. The unauthorized publication was controversial for reasons that went beyond the question of authorization. Eisenman's interpretive framework was regarded with considerable skepticism by many scroll scholars, and the photographs were presented without the kind of systematic scholarly apparatus that would have made them most useful to researchers attempting to work with the material. But their existence and the fact of their publication contributed to the accumulation of forces that the team could no longer contain, and the photographs themselves, whatever one thought of Eisenman's theories, gave scholars something they had not had before: direct access to the visual evidence of what the unpublished fragments actually contained. The opening of the archive did not resolve every dispute about the scrolls or settle every question that the monopoly had prevented from being asked. Scholarship does not work that way. What it did was restore to the scholarly community the fundamental condition that makes scholarship possible: the ability to look at the primary evidence and form one's own judgment about it, rather than being dependent on the judgments of a closed group with its own interests and perspectives. The discoveries in the Judean Desert series, the official publication project, whose slow pace had been the central grievance of the controversy, continue to appear in the years and decades after 1991. completing the publication of the fragments under the direction of Emmanuel Tov and a substantially expanded team, and doing so with a thoroughness and scholarly rigor that the crisis of 1991 had in some ways clarified and intensified. The eventual completion of the series, which took until the early years of the 21st century, represented the fulfillment, very late but genuine, of the commitment that had been made in the 1950s when DeVos assembled his team in the scriptorium of the Palestine Archaeological Museum. What the story of the monopoly's collapse leaves beyond the specific sequence of events is a set of questions about academic institutions and the public interest in ancient texts that have not been fully resolved and perhaps cannot be. The scrolls belonged, in some meaningful sense, to everyone, and the scholars who were assigned to study them had a responsibility to that broader ownership that the institutional arrangements of the Scroll Project had made it possible to ignore for too long. The collapse of the monopoly was not a vindication of any particular theory about what the scrolls contained. It was a vindication of the principle that the public record of human history is not the private property of the people who happen to be studying it at any given moment. A principle that sounds obvious when stated plainly and that turns out to be surprisingly difficult to enforce in practice. The monopoly had ended. The 40 years were over. The fragments were, at last, available, and the world that had been waiting so long to know what was in them was, finally, about to find out. The monopoly that had survived 40 years of outrage collapsed within roughly 3 months. The sequence that brought it down, Strogno's removal, the Concordance reconstruction, the Huntington's decision, and the authorities' capitulation happened faster than almost anyone had expected, after it had been building for longer than almost anyone had been patient enough to wait. It had the quality of a dam giving way, nothing for decades, and then the whole structure in a matter of months. The specific reasons for this compression are worth considering, because they are not simply a matter of pressure having finally built to an irresistible level, though that was part of it. They are also a matter of the particular vulnerabilities that the team had accumulated over the years, the legal indefensibility of the intellectual property claim, the institutional embarrassment of the Strognall affair, the existence of the concordance outside the team's control, the Huntington's independent decision to act, each of these weaknesses being exploited more or less simultaneously by forces that had no particular coordination with one another, but whose effects compounded. The scholars who had been waiting, in some cases for entire careers, to see the unpublished material did not experience the opening of the archive as a dramatic moment of triumph. The process was more gradual than that, and the access that became available in the months following the Huntington's announcement was, in the first instance, access to photographs and to the concordance reconstruction, not to the physical fragments themselves. The experience of finally engaging with material that had been withheld was, for most of the scholars involved, a mixture of genuine scholarly excitement and a quieter awareness that the decades of delay had imposed a cost that access alone could not recover. The questions that might have been asked and answered in the 1970s had not been held in suspension, waiting to be answered once the texts were available. Scholarship had moved around those questions, had developed other approaches, had sometimes arrived at answers through different routes, and the opening of the archive in 1991 entered a field that was already different from the field of 1951, in ways that made some of the previously unpublished material less revelatory than it would have been if it had been available 40 years earlier. The conspiracy theories that had accumulated during the long silence were, in the aftermath, examined more systematically than had previously been possible. The claim that the Vatican was actively suppressing scroll material that contradicted Christian doctrine had been one of the most persistent, partly because of the team's composition and partly because of the nature of the anxieties that the long silence had created. The claim was based on the fact that several team members had Catholic institutional affiliations and on the assumption, which turned out to be entirely unjustified, that the unpublished texts contained material of the explosive variety that Allegro had implied. When the texts became available, scholars examined them for evidence of Vatican involvement in the suppression and found none. What they found instead was the more ordinary and less satisfying explanation that had always been available to anyone willing to look at the institutional history without the conspiracy framework. A group of scholars who had been given too much authority over material they considered their own, who had operated without adequate institutional oversight for too long, and who had allowed a delay, began as reasonable caution to harden, through the accumulation of years and the development of institutional self-interest, into something that looked like suppression because it functioned like suppression, even if it had not been deliberately designed as such. The question of black market trading in fragments, the claim that individual scroll pieces had been bought and sold by private collectors outside any official framework, turned out to have considerably more substance, though not in the form the conspiracy theories had assumed. The antiquities market for scroll fragments was real and had been operating since the earliest days of the discovery, connected to Kundo and the Tamire network that had first brought the scrolls to scholarly attention, and portions of the collection had indeed passed through private hands in ways that complicated the official narrative of controlled scholarly access. Some of these fragments eventually reached institutions and scholars through channels that were not entirely transparent, and the question of their legal status and their relationship to the official collection was not a simple one. The extent of this parallel market and its relationship to the official publication project remains a matter of scholarly discussion, and it is one of the aspects of the scroll story that has not been entirely resolved even in the decades since the formal monopoly ended. What it illustrates, as much as anything else in this story, is that the real history of the scrolls has always been more complicated and more human than either the official narrative or the conspiracy theories wanted to acknowledge. What the evidence did not support was the most lurid version of the suppression narrative, the deliberate concealment by organized religious institutions of texts specifically designed to undermine Christian or Jewish doctrine. This version had always been more about the anxieties of the people who believed it than about the actual content of the scrolls. And when the scrolls became available, it dissolved, as such narratives usually do, in the face of actual evidence. The institutional failure that had kept the scrolls from the world for 40 years was real and serious, and had done genuine damage to scholarship and to the public interest. It did not need to be a conspiracy to be a scandal. It was already quite sufficient as a story of ordinary institutional self-interest pursued past the point where any reasonable defense of it was possible. A story that required no villain with a plan, only a system that rewarded delay and punished nothing, operating for long enough that delay became its own form of policy. This is the cost that is hardest to calculate and perhaps the most important to acknowledge, not the scandal of the monopoly itself, which is visible and documented and has been discussed at length, but the lost decades of scholarship, the paths not taken, the questions not asked because the evidence was unavailable, the conversations between different bodies of ancient knowledge that did not happen. And for 40 years because one of the parties to those conversations was locked in a museum in Jerusalem. We will never know what the scholarship of the second half of the 20th century might have looked like if the scrolls had been published in the 1960s. We can only know what it did look like, and note the gap, and we can observe with the particular clarity that comes from knowing how the story ended, that the gap was not inevitable, that the decision to create and maintain it was made by specific people in specific institutions who had alternatives available to them and chose not to take them, and that the world they left behind was smaller for the choice. The monopoly had ended. The 40 years were over. The fragments were, at last, available. And the world that had been waiting so long to know what was in them was, finally, about to find out. And so the archive opened, and the world that had been waiting came to the table, and the question that had sustained 40 years of controversy finally had a chance to be answered. We can move forward now into the scrolls themselves, into what they actually contain and what that content actually means, leaving behind the story of who controlled them and entering the story of what they say. It is, in its own way, the quieter and more lasting part of the story, less dramatic than the monopoly and its collapse, but more important, because it is the part that will still be generating scholarship and changing understanding long after the scandal of the access restrictions has been absorbed into the institutional history of the field. The first thing that strikes a reader encountering the Dead Sea Scrolls for the first time, if that reader has been shaped by the decades of conspiracy theory that preceded open access, is how ordinary most of the material is. Not ordinary in the sense of uninteresting, because the texts are deeply interesting and their significance is genuine and substantial. Ordinary in the sense that they are not the sensational disclosures that the theories had promised, not the hidden gospels, not the secret teachings of Jesus, not the suppressed alternative scriptures that institutional Christianity had been concealing from the faithful. They are, in their overwhelming majority, exactly what the scholars who had seen them had been saying they were for decades. A library assembled by a Jewish sect in the desert, containing copies of biblical texts, sectarian documents describing the community's own beliefs and practices, and a varied collection of other writings, some of which illuminate the religious world of Second Temple Judaism in ways that have genuinely transformed scholarship, and none of which requires the wholesale revision of Christian or Jewish doctrine that the conspiracy theories had anticipated. The biblical scrolls are, for many scholars, the most immediately significant portion of the collection. Before 1937, the oldest known copies of the books of the Hebrew Bible dated from the medieval period, produced by the Masoretic scribes who standardized the text of the Hebrew scriptures between roughly the 6th and 10th centuries of the Common Era. The copies they produced were careful and consistent, and the Masoretic text has formed the basis of most modern translations of the Old Testament. But scholars had always known that between the original composition of the biblical books and the medieval copies, there lay more than 1,000 years of textual transmission, during which the texts had been copied and recopied by hand, translated into Greek and Aramaic and other languages, used in worship and study by communities with different textual traditions, and subjected to all the small variations and occasional larger ones that the process of manuscript transmission inevitably introduces. The Dead Sea Scrolls, by providing copies of biblical texts that predated the Masoretic manuscripts by roughly 1,000 years, offered the first direct window into the textual situation of the Hebrew Bible during a period that had previously been accessible only through inference and reconstruction. What the biblical scrolls revealed about that earlier period was simultaneously reassuring and unsettling, depending on what a reader had expected to find. The Isaiah scroll, the most complete of the biblical manuscripts, confirmed the accuracy of the Masoretic text to a remarkable degree, showing that the transmission process over 1,000 years had preserved the text with a fidelity that exceeded what many scholars had assumed was possible. This was genuinely significant, and it offered a kind of empirical validation of a textual tradition that had previously rested on faith in the reliability of the scribal process. But the same scrolls also showed that the biblical text in this period was not as fixed or as uniform as the Masoretic tradition's consistency had implied. There were variant readings, some of them minor and some of them more substantial. There were copies of some biblical books that aligned closely with the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible produced in Alexandria in the 3rd and 2nd centuries before the Common Era, in ways that suggested the Greek translators had been working from Hebrew manuscripts that differed in certain respects from the manuscripts that differed in certain respects from the manuscripts that became the basis of the Masoretic tradition. There were copies of other books that showed textual traditions not clearly represented in any other manuscript tradition, suggesting that the process of arriving at a standard biblical text was longer and more complex than the official history of the canon had indicated. The scrolls did not show that the Bible was unreliable or that its transmission had been fraudulent. They showed the process of arriving at the fixed standard text we now read was a human process, conducted over centuries involving real choices and real alternatives, and that the alternatives were more various than had been known. Sit with that for a moment, because it is perhaps the most genuinely significant thing the scrolls have to say, and it tends to get lost in the drama of the access controversy. The text now called the Bible did not arrive in the world in their present form, fixed and complete and unalterable. They were assembled and standardized over time through a process that involved competing textual traditions, scholarly and religious decision-making, and the practical realities of manuscript transmission across a multilingual world. We knew this before the Dead Sea Scrolls, but the scrolls made it visible in a way that no amount of inferential argument could have achieved, by providing the direct material evidence of an earlier stage of the process, a stage at which the texts were still in motion. The sectarian documents, the texts that describe the beliefs and practices of the Qumran community itself, offer a different kind of significance from the biblical scrolls. They are not copies of existing tradition, but original compositions, and they speak in a voice that is unlike anything else that has survived from the period. Reading them, you are not reading texts that were preserved because they were sacred to a later tradition that revered them. You are reading texts that survived by accident, by the chance conjunction of a community that hid its library and a desert climate dry enough to preserve what was hidden, and their survival gives them a quality that few ancient documents possess. The quality of saying exactly what they mean without the mediation of any tradition that selected them for preservation because of what they could be to mean. The major sectarian documents include the community rule, a text that lays out the organization, the theological principles, and the behavioral expectations of the Qumran group with a specificity that suggests it was a working document, consulted and applied in the daily life of the community, rather than a theoretical statement of ideals. The Damascus document, which had actually been known before the cave discoveries through copies found in a Cairo synagogue in the 19th century, proved on examination to be closely related to the community rule, and its presence at Qumran established a connection between the sect and communities elsewhere in the Jewish world that complicated the simple picture of an isolated desert community. The War Scroll describes in elaborate detail a final apocalyptic battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, a conflict that the community expected to be both literal and cosmic, played out on a real battlefield, but also representing the ultimate confrontation between good and evil that would precede the New Age. The Temple Scroll is perhaps the most ambitious of the sectarian documents, a lengthy text that presents itself as divine speech addressed directly to Moses, offering detailed prescriptions for the construction of an ideal temple and the conduct of worship within it that depart in significant ways from the practices of the Jerusalem temple the sect had rejected, and the Hodiot, or thanksgiving hymns offer something different again. A collection of poetic prayers that speak in the first person, that express gratitude and wonder and a sense of having been chosen and illuminated, and that provide a window into the inner life of the community's members in a way that the legal and procedural texts do not. These texts established the Qumran community as a group that understood itself in terms of radical separatism and imminent eschatology. They had withdrawn from the Jerusalem temple, which they regarded as corrupt and defiled, and from mainstream Jewish society, which they believed had departed from the true covenant. They lived under a strict communal rule, shared property, underwent ritual purification, and believed that the end of the present age was near, and that they, the sons of light, would play a central role in the final conflict between good and evil that would precede the coming of the Messianic era. This self-understanding is deeply interesting in itself, but its larger significance lies in what it reveals about the diversity of Second Temple Judaism. The Judaism of the centuries around the beginning of the Common Era was not a monolithic tradition. The scrolls confirm and amplify what was already known from other sources, that this period saw an extraordinary proliferation of Jewish sectarian movements, each with its own interpretation of the covenant, its own understanding of the requirements of the law, its own eschatological expectations, and its own claims to authentic continuity with the tradition of Moses and the prophets. The Pharisees and the Sadducees, who are familiar from the New Testament, were only two of these movements. The Qumran community represents another, and the scrolls allow us to hear it speaking in its own voice rather than being described from outside, which is the only way we know most of the other sectarian movements of the period. The significance of this for understanding Christian origins is considerable, and it is here that the scrolls have had their most lasting impact on scholarship, though not in the direction that the conspiracy theories had anticipated. The scrolls did not provide evidence that Jesus was a copy of a Qumran figure, or that early Christianity was simply Essenism repackaged, or that the New Testament accounts of Jesus' teaching were borrowed from the sect's documents. What they provided was something more nuanced and more valuable. A demonstration of the conceptual vocabulary that was available in the Jewish world into which Christianity was born. Ideas that had seemed, before the scrolls, to be distinctively Christian innovations. The conflict between light and darkness, the figure of the teacher of righteousness, the expectation of a new covenant, the emphasis on communal meals, the concern with ritual purity. All of these turn out to have parallels or analogues in the Qumran texts, suggesting that they were part of a broader repertoire of fish religious imagination that early Christianity shared with and drew from in ways that the previous isolation of the New Testament from its Jewish context had obscured. There are also, in the scroll collection, texts that do not fit neatly into any of the obvious categories. Texts whose relationship to the Qumran community is uncertain, whose genre is unusual, or whose content touches on traditions that appear in no other surviving source. The Temple Scroll, for instance, presents its legal prescriptions as divine speech addressed directly to Moses, a presentational strategy that claims an authority beyond that of any known human author, and that complicates the relationship between the text and the canonical Torah in ways that scholars continue to debate. The Genesis Apocryphon retells stories from the book of Genesis, with elaborations and additions that are not in the canonical text, providing a window into the tradition of creative scriptural expansion that was a significant feature of Jewish religious culture in this period. The Pesha texts, which are interpretive commentaries on biblical books, apply the words of the prophets to the specific situation of the Qumran community in ways that illuminate both the community's self-understanding and the interpretive methods that shaped early biblical commentary. The scrolls do not overturn the Bible. They do not reveal that Jesus was married, or that the Vatican suppressed a secret gospel, or that the origins of Christianity were fabricated from whole cloth by a conspiracy of priests. They reveal something that is, in its own way, more interesting, that the world into which both Rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity were born was richer, more varied, more contested, and more intellectually alive than the traditions that descended from it have always found it convenient to acknowledge. The texts that became canonical did not simply emerge from the tradition as its natural and inevitable expression. They were selected from a much larger and more diverse body of religious thought. And the process of selection involved real choices about what to include and what to leave aside. Choices whose consequences shaped the subsequent history of two of the world's major religions. What the scrolls ultimately offer, once the noise of the access controversy has subsided, is not revelation but complexity, not secrets but depth, not the overthrow of tradition, but a fuller understanding of the world in which tradition was formed. The scholars who spent 40 years preventing the world from reading them may have believed, in some cases, that the texts contained dangerous material, and in a narrow sense they were perhaps right. The scrolls are dangerous to any reading of religious history that requires simplicity, that needs its origins to be clean, and its texts to be fixed, and its traditions to have emerged from a single soul. Thus, rather than from the messy plurality of a living religious culture, what the texts actually contained was the kind of complicated, ambiguous, humanly entangled truth that is always more difficult to manage than simple revelation, and always more valuable than the versions of the past that institutions prefer to tell. The question this story began with, the question of what the scroll team was afraid the scrolls would say, turns out, on examination, to have an answer that is both more and less satisfying than the conspiracy theories anticipated. They were not afraid of a specific text that said a specific thing. They were, insofar as institutional behavior can be reduced to an emotional state, afraid of complexity itself, afraid of a world in which the origins of the traditions they studied and, in some cases, served were more various and more human than those traditions preferred to present themselves as being. That fear, applied to ancient texts over decades by serious and intelligent people, produced one of the more remarkable institutional failures in the history of modern scholarship. And the texts themselves, finally available to the world, turned out to be well worth the 40 years of waiting. What the scrolls say, the world now knows. What remains is what always remains after a long story has been told. The place itself, and the silence, and the light on the limestone cliffs in the afternoon. We can let the argument rest now, and the scholarship rest, and return to where the story began, to the desert above the Dead Sea, to see what is still there. The caves are still there, cut into the limestone cliffs above the Dead Sea. Small dark openings in the pale rock that you can see from the road if you know where to look, unremarkable from the outside, the kind of place a stone would pass through without leaving a mark. The archaeologists finished their work decades ago, and the plateau at Qumran is open to visitors now. The outlines of the ancient buildings visible in the dust. The whole site sitting in a silence that feels less like emptiness and more like something that has said everything it has to say and is simply waiting. A visitor who stands there on a winter afternoon, looking from the plateau out across the Dead Sea, is standing in the same light that the scribes of the community stood in 2,000 years before, and the light has not changed, and the sea has not changed, and the cliffs have not changed, and the cliffs have not changed, and only the people are gone. The plateau itself is not dramatic. That is the first thing visitors tend to notice. You expect drama. Given the story, given the weight of what was found here and what was disputed about it for half a century. And instead you find a low, flat expanse of chalky ground overlooking the grey stillness of the Dead Sea, with the remains of walls that were never tall to begin with, their stones spread and settled by 2,000 years of time. The community that lived here was not large by any measure, perhaps 100 people at the height of its occupation, perhaps somewhat more, living in a place that offered almost nothing in the way of comfort and almost everything in the way of isolation. They had chosen the desert deliberately, the way people choose the desert when they have decided that the world they knew is beyond redemption and that the only reasonable response is to put distance between themselves and it, and to spend whatever time remains in trying to preserve what they believed was worth preserving. The site at Qumran has been excavated and studied and argued over almost as much as the scrolls themselves. There have been scholars who disputed the connection between the ruins and the caves, who argued that the texts were not written here, but brought here from elsewhere, perhaps from Jerusalem, perhaps from multiple communities scattered across the Judean landscape. The scholarly consensus, though it is not unanimous, holds that the connection is real, that the community whose ruins are visible on the plateau is the community that produced and preserved the library that ended up in the caves. But the uncertainty itself is worth noting, because it is characteristic of the scroll's story. The material evidence is abundant, and the conclusions it supports are less fixed than they might appear. The cliffs above the plateau change color through the day. In the morning they are pale, almost white, the color of bone or of old parchment, catching the early light and giving it back without warmth. In the afternoon they go gold, then amber, then, in the last hour before sunset, something closer to copper, the color deepening in the shadows of the cave mouths and fading on the exposed faces of the rock. At night, they are gray. The Dead Sea below them is always flat, always still. The air above it carrying the mineral smell that the scroll's first finders would have breathed on the afternoon they brought their discovery back to camp. Not knowing what they had, the scrolls themselves are in Jerusalem now, in the shrine of the book, a building constructed specifically to house them and designed by architects who had studied the shape of the clay jar lids in which the first scrolls were found. The building's white dome echoes that shape, a sealed vessel translated into architecture, and it sits in the grounds of the Israel Museum in a way that makes the connection between the ancient library and the modern institution explicit and deliberate. The juxtaposition is worth sitting with. The texts that spent 1900 years in clay jars in a desert cave are now in a purpose-built institution in a city that did not exist in any form the jar makers would have recognized, displayed under controlled light in a building designed to receive them, visited by people from every part of the world. Inside, the great Isaiah scroll is displayed in its full length, unrolled and lit. The careful ancient handwriting visible to anyone who comes to look, which is what its authors, in their different and darker circumstance, could never have imagined for it. The shrine of the book is well attended. The visitors who come to see the scrolls are a varied group, scholars and tourists, and the simply curious, people for whom the connection to the most ancient layers of religious tradition has a personal dimension, and people for whom it does not, people who know the story of the monopoly and find it still faintly irritating, and people who know only that these are very old texts and that they matter. They stand in front of the Isaiah scroll, and they look at the writing, which is clear and careful and beautiful in the way that skilled handwriting is always beautiful. And some of them can read it, and many of them cannot. But the handwriting communicates something even to readers who cannot pass the letters, that it was made with care, that the person who made it understood that what they were doing mattered, that the words were worth the effort, preservation. What the visitors are looking at, in the end, is not the text alone, but the act of transmission. The evidence of someone deciding that what they knew was worth passing forward, worth the years of training and the hours of careful work and the care taken with the materials, worth the effort to make something that might last. The scribes of Qumran did not know how long it would last, or what the world on the other side of its survival would be like, or what the arguments about their library would eventually become. They knew only what they were doing in the moment they were doing it, which was copying texts they believed were sacred, in a community they believed was holy, in a desert they had chosen because they thought the rest of the world had failed. The rest of the world went on without them. Their library went into the dark, and the dark kept it. That is what survives, in the end. Not the community, not the people, not the world they believed was ending. The handwriting survives. The words survive. The argument about what to do with them has been going on for 2,000 years. And the more recent argument about who got to decide what they meant has been resolved, after a fashion, after 40 years of unnecessary delay. What has not been resolved, and what the scrolls themselves would not resolve, even if every fragment were perfectly legible and perfectly understood, is the larger question of how the past becomes the tradition and the tradition becomes the present, of who gets to tell that story, and on what terms and to whose benefit. The scrolls are now part of the conversation, available to anyone who wishes to engage with them, published in editions that are accessible to specialists and in translations that are accessible to everyone, interpreted and reinterpreted by a scholarship that no longer operates behind a closed door. That is the situation that the 40 years of controversy eventually produced. It is the situation that should have existed from the beginning. The caves are quiet now. The fragments are in museums and universities and digital archives, photographed and transcribed and published and argued over and argued over and argued over again, which is what ancient texts do when they are cared for by a living scholarly tradition. The desert keeps what the desert is given and releases it slowly, in pieces, over centuries, and what it released above the Dead Sea in the winter of 1947 is still being absorbed. There is something in the story of the scrolls that resists being finished, that keeps opening up into new questions the longer you sit with it. The discovery was not an ending. The publication was not an ending. The publication, the access controversy, and its resolution were not an ending. The texts have been read and studied and argued over for 75 years now, and they continue to generate scholarship, continue to complicate the pictures we thought we had of the ancient world, continue to resist the desire for simple answers that the conspiracy theories expressed in one form and the tradition expressed in another. What the scrolls represent, when everything else has been said, is evidence that the past was inhabited by people who were as serious and as complicated and as various as we are, who were asking questions we are still asking, who were arguing about things we are still arguing about, and who preserved what they valued with a care and a dedication that kept their library intact for 2,000 years. In the dark, the 40-year argument about access was a very human thing with very human causes, and it is over. The scrolls remain. The questions they carry are not. That is what old things do when they have been carefully made and carefully kept. They outlast the arguments about them. They remain. The light goes from the cliffs. The sea holds its stillness. The cave mouths remain dark. The scribes who copied these texts did not know they were writing for posterity. They were writing for their community, for the people around them who shared their beliefs and their fears, for a world they thought was ending very soon. They were right about the ending. The Romans came, as they had feared, and the community at Qumran was destroyed, and the people who had hidden the scrolls in the cliffs never came back for them. The jars sat in the dark for 1900 years. What survives is the handwriting, careful, deliberate, the product of years of scribal training, pressed into parchment by men whose names we will never know, working by lamplight in a desert community that believed it was the last true remnant of something precious. The ink has faded in places. The parchment has cracked and fragmented and been reassembled by scholars with tweezers and patience. But the words are still there. The texts they copied have been argued over for 2,000 years, and the copies they made have now been argued over for another 75. The arguments will continue. That is what happens when something matters enough. The desert keeps things. The dry air, the sealed jars, the darkness of the caves. What the scribes of Qumran placed inside those jars was not just their library. It was a question addressed to whatever future might eventually come to look for it. The question has been found now. It is still being answered. Thank you for spending this evening in the desert, in the long, strange story of what happens when ancient words meet modern fear. If this kind of history is what you come here for at night, subscribing to the channel means the next story will find you when it is ready. There is always another secret that took longer than it should have to reach the light. Always another extraordinary thing underneath a simpler story that someone decided to tell instead. Sleep well.